I'd like to talk briefly about a research project that I completed not long ago. It's about real estate prices, which is a topic that's on everybody's mind these days, although I started this project a couple of years ago, so at that point it wasn't such a hot topic of current interest. Our study has to do with how interest rates or mortgage interest rates affect real estate values. The typical thought of most people, and that you see in the financial press and that people like Alan Greenspan talked about, is that if you have higher mortgage rates, real estate values tend to decline. And there's some logic to this, because obviously if mortgage rates go up, the monthly payment that people will have to pay when they buy a house for a particular value will go up with those mortgage interest rates. And so the affordability of a house of a particular price should decline for people in a given income bracket when mortgage rates go up. So most people believe that's really true. But there's a reason why it's not so obvious, and the reason has to do with the fact that interest rates go up and down mainly because inflation gets higher or lower. So we talk about nominal interest rates like mortgage interest rates. When the rate of inflation is expected to be higher, those interest rates go up to compensate lenders for the loss of purchasing power on the loans that they extend to the borrowers. And when inflation goes down, interest rates tend to decline with inflation. There is another component of nominal interest rates, though, and that is what's called the real rate of interest, which is the rate of interest that you would have if there's no inflation whatsoever. Most economists think that the real rate of interest is fairly low, let's say 1 or 2%, and that it doesn't vary a lot, so that when you see mortgage interest rates, which have ranged over the last 20 years from, let's say, lows of 4.5% to highs of 15%, most of that variation is due to changes in the expected inflation rate. So it occurred to me that there may be a reason to think that an increase in mortgage interest rates that's caused by a rise of inflation might not have an impact on the real value of housing, for the simple reason that in the United States, most people who are mortgage borrowers can deduct the interest on those mortgage loans from their income taxes. So that basically when you get an increase in interest rates, let's say from 5% to 10%, that extra 5% gives a higher deductible expense to the mortgage borrower. And that's a compensation to the lender for the erosion in the purchasing power as higher inflation occurs. So what happens there, when you think about it, is basically in a really high inflation environment, the entire principal amount of the mortgage can be deducted from your income taxes over time, and that's a lot bigger than the deduction for the real interest rate. So it seems possible that there would actually be a positive impact of an increase in interest rates on real estate values rather than a negative impact because of this mortgage deductibility. Now, there is an offsetting factor, though, and that is that the lenders, the people who provide mortgage capital, have to pay taxes on their interest income. So really, the effect on real estate values of an increase in interest rates that's caused by inflation has to do with the relative tax rates of borrowers and lenders. And since lenders are mainly in the U.S. mortgage market either tax-exempt institutions such as pension funds or foreigners, it's probably true that borrowers have higher tax rates, so that we would expect to see an increase in interest rates accompanied by an increase in housing prices rather than a decrease. And in fact, empirical evidence has shown that over historical periods, housing prices have done well when interest rates are really high. They've also done fairly well when interest rates are low, so it's not so obvious there's any direct connection between interest rates and inflation. Now, it occurred to us, though, that there's a natural experiment that we might run to empirically check this out, because our neighbor to the north, Canada, does not allow borrowers to deduct mortgage interest from their income taxes. And so in Canada, what you'd expect to find is that an increase in interest rates caused by increasing inflation would have a reduction in the value of real estate. And whatever the effect is in the U.S., it should be much less severe than in Canada. So what we did is we collected data on real estate prices for a long historical period, and basically by using inflation index bonds, we separated out expected inflation and real interest rates, and we looked at the effect in the United States and Canada of the inflation component of interest rates. And what we found was that, in fact, when you get an increase in inflation, and that inflation is feeding into higher mortgage rates, in the U.S., real estate values actually go up. They don't go up very much. The effect is, is pretty small, actually, but it's positive. In Canada, though, it's strongly negative. And so this kind of bears out, the empirical results do support the idea that there is not, as contrary to popular belief, a strong negative impact of interest rates on housing prices. In fact, it goes the other way if the interest rate increase has been induced by higher inflation. And in Canada, where you don't have the mortgage deductibility, is strongly negative, and that kind of supports the view, too, that the reason why there's a big difference in the two countries is that this mortgage deductibility. And by the way, in every other variable that we use to look at real estate values in the U.S. and Canada, such as real interest rates, equity, market price indexes, and other things, the two countries are very similar. It's only this one thing, expected inflation, that there's any degree of dissimilarity, and that strongly is a big contrast in the two countries. So I think it's an interesting study of real estate, and goes against what most people have believed and what you read in the popular press. It also has some policy implications, because when you think about it, what Canada has done as a country is it taxes mortgage lenders. They have to pay tax on the interest income they receive. The borrowers don't get to deduct the interest from their income taxes. So, you would think that asymmetry between the way taxes are imposed on borrowers and lenders is particularly bad in Canada, and probably causes a long-term lowering of real estate values relative to a country like the U.S., where there's basically a symmetry between lenders and borrowers, and it taxes lenders, but it allows tax deduction for borrowers.